Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Jean Stafford is known primarily for the short stories that she wrote from the 1940s through the 1960s. The critic Ihab Hassan, writing in Western Review, describes them as being characterized by the intimate glimpse unresolved, the moment of sudden knowledge, the reversal of a crisis. She was a well-known author in her time, awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1970, but she's no longer read as much as some of her peers like Eudora Welty or Flannery O'Connor. Last year, Farrar, Straus and Giroux released a paperback edition of the collected short stories, an invitation to reevaluate Jean Stafford's work. And joining me now to discuss her work and life is, for this next installment of our Underread Book Club series, is Anne Beattie, an award-winning novelist and master of the short story form in her own right. Welcome to our show, Anne.
Thank you.
Were you already writing short stories when you first read Stafford?
No, I don't think I was. She used to be anthologized a lot more than she has been in recent years. And I think probably as a reader, I knew her before I really started trying to seriously become a writer.
Did her writing influence you, do you think?
I know it's kind of a conversation stopper, but I wouldn't think so.
Although there are some stories that sound like you were thinking about something she wrote. We'll get to that in a moment.
Well, she was wonderfully diverse. I can't say certainly that, some of the domestic moments and so forth wouldn't have influenced a lot of people once they got that voice into their head.
She was considered an important writer during her lifetime. Why do you think that she's less well read these days than some of her peers?
I think that there are different ways, certainly, of looking at what she was doing, but I would think that part of it is simply that she was very often obviously involved in investigating things like the difference between classes, the difference between social classes, the difference in power imbalances between men and women, things that in some ways we continue to be focusing on and fascinated with for all good reason. But I think it had a kind of, I don't feel this way, but a kind of old-fashioned or a kind of almost formulaic way of presenting itself that I'm more interested in seeing the differences in. But I think someone who just read a story by Jean Stafford, who knows which story that was, and she was often published in The New Yorker, and I think she became equated with a group of writers writing about social mores at the time, and that time is not exactly our time.
You've told me that In the Zoo is your current favorite among her stories. There's nothing formulaic about that. It starts off sounding
really
like it's going to be
story.
one story, and then it just transforms itself into something totally different.
Well, I love that about her because really, even if people are not, uniformly enthusiastic about Jean Stafford, certainly she goes both ways because she can write the most focused, highly visual prose, as she does at the beginning of that story when you don't know where you are, you're not oriented as the reader. She simply beautifully describes an old polar bear sitting in the zoo, and then she moves right away from that. It's almost like camera work. It's almost like, the way movies come in very close to something, they linger for a moment, we don't know any context, suddenly there's a pullback and we have a huge panorama, and we're also disoriented. But you don't forget that your first cue is that, hey, be humble, you're disoriented.
But doesn't it break one of the rules that we're often told about short stories, that they are focused on one thing and digressions are for novelists?
Oh, but of course we all exist to break those rules and so admire the people who do. I wouldn't necessarily think to compare Stafford in any way really to Alice Munro, but Alice Munro is famous for having little vignettes, or however you would typify them, that exist really out of space and time, except that they're placed first in her stories. And then as the story goes along, number one, you start to forget that you ever read that, but number two, when it comes back and it's really part of the text, you think, oh, it was like a flash forward all along, but I had no context for it.
Should we see a little Dickens in this story of orphans abandoned to her horrible guardian?
Absolutely, and I think it was known that she came from a family in which her father, at least, read aloud to the story to the children, and he read stories by Dickens and Shakespeare. I think you can hear a lot of voices. I think that's an interesting thing about her as a writer, how redolent it is of other voices.
I Googled her, of course, and they have a list of writers who supposedly influenced her, and they were all men, even though her major subject is the lives of women. Yeah,
there you go. Well, also, I think the influences, I Googled her too, but I think that was several months ago, so I don't remember everything I found out. But I think her father was also fond of reading Russian writers to her, and you were not going to see in those days, in that culture, women writing. I mean, perhaps years later, memoirs or diaries, but not at the moment very much.
And the zoo is in the first person, and that's also a rarity for her.
Yes, it is, and it's a rarity that for someone it's a rarity. But another person who rarely writes in the first person is William Trevor, and we all know the pitfalls of it, writing in the first person. That way that you can't back off enough from the persona you're projecting being confused with yourself.
Is that something that you've had to contend with in writing your own stories? Start off writing in a first person, saying, maybe this should be third person.
I don't think personally that's a kind of revision I ever do, but I certainly do abandon whole stories, and it may be simply from the get-go that I had selected the wrong person.
In the Zoo reminded me in a way of one of your stories, Wanda's, where...
Wow, how thrilling. I must interrupt. That reminded you of Wanda's?
Well, because there is a child, what's her name, May, who's left with a mother's friend and named Wanda, who also runs a boarding house, as these girls have been left with somebody. But the difference is your character's a lot nicer.
Yes, well, and even within Jean Stafford's story, the two sisters speaking to one another complain about how difficult their life was, because of this woman who raised them, who is not even a family member. You're absolutely right. I had never read that story, though, I swear to you, until I read the collected stories.
So it just was an independent coincidence?
Yes and no. I mean, Stafford had a very difficult life. I don't want to bog down, early on or just, speak only about her biography. But she at least had difficulty with her childhood, even if it wasn't so appreciably difficult for her sisters and for her brother. And I'm an only child, and I think that idea of feeling like you're an outsider within a family for whatever reason is a hard one to ever shake in terms of your adaptability to the larger world.
In her introduction to the collected stories that has just been published last year, I think, Joyce Carol Oates describes In the Zoo as domestic Gothicism.
Oh, that's wonderful. I did not know that.
Should we assume that she drew from events in her own childhood for a story like that, even though she wasn't an orphan?
Well, I think, sure, you do assume that people draw from events in their childhood, and if you've read the biography, you can understand that it is factually true that she and her sister met in later years, although Jean Stafford often wasn't so keen to do that. But in any case, certainly it would make sense that they would be reflecting on the past. But, one of the things I like about that story, as we were mentioning earlier, is that when we do move away from the bear itself in the zoo, then it's not...
Which reminds them of a man they knew when they were kids.
Which reminds them of a man they knew when they were kids, and that man, in fact, ended up giving them a dog, which is something we all know we're not supposed to do without asking the guardian of the child, may the child have a dog. But they end up loving this dog themselves, and you think, oh, that's what the story is going to be about. It's going to be about this kind of bonding that's not that, segregating some poor animal in a zoo, and everybody's going to have a better life, and it turns out quite the opposite. opposite, because the woman who is raising them and who's running the rooming house really conducts. I mean, this is where Joyce Carol Oates comes in with Gothicism, you're right. I mean, she really ends up having, in effect, an emotional love affair with the dog. She, in effect, yet more is taken away from these two children, tragically.
Because she's
even
so
the dog
manipulative.
itself is so manipulative. She even renames the dog.
One of the characters in a story of yours, the Indian Uprising, says that a lot of people write stories when, quote, they can't seem to figure out who and what they are. It might be an oversimplification, but they seem to write poetry when they do know. Was that you speaking, or was that your character speaking?
I'll just be honest, that was me speaking, but it was a real non sequitur kind of ending to that story. And usually I let things in rough draft sort of pop out, and then if I want to fix them later, of course I fix them. Actually, I ran that past a couple of friends of mine who were poets, and they grumbled about that. They really thought that was an unhelpful generalization, and I don't know it in the bone the way they do. But nevertheless, I was just so happy with that weird thought, because that's one of the fun things about writing, that something pops in your head and you think, do I believe that? You know, you might write it because it alliterates, or you might write it just to be provocative, and then you think, maybe I do believe that.
Well, as you said, one of the problems with the first person is if you express an opinion, put it into a character's mouth, people assume that it's your opinion, even if it's really the character that you've invented.
Yeah, but I mean, writers are on guard against that. Writers know that. But sometimes writers flirt with it. I mean, Philip Roth is well known for writing novels that he protests wildly. The character Philip Roth is not Philip Roth, him. Nevertheless, what are we to do that? Kathy Acker, I mean, autofiction in general, It
goes back earlier, Marcel Proust.
Marcel Proust, indeed, yes.
Do writers of short stories have to consider whether to either wrap everything up for the reader, like O. Henry did in The Gift of the Magi, or because you say you've been asked many times in interviews how you know when a story is finished?
Mm-hmm. Stafford, well, let me not talk about Stafford right away. I do think that's a difficult question to answer, because there probably is very little, except for maybe playing video games, and they're open-ended for so long that that's almost the thrill of them. They do conclude maybe at some point, even if it's just because your battery runs out. But this idea of concluding things, I don't see elsewhere either. I don't see that things aren't left open-ended in music all the time. Film, terribly ambiguous endings seem to be all that do suit us in a lot of ways. And it's always this kind of prohibition against something that might be considered just not sophisticated enough to tie things up. But I would suspect that it's not just avoiding that on the part of writers, or at least, my contemporaries, and the short story for a long time. I would say it's more with wanting to do a haunting, wanting to leave people with some ambiguity, because somehow you're not writing to legislate, you're writing to open up the territory.
There's also the feeling that life will go on after this story has ended, and if you tie everything up, then life doesn't seem to go on.
Well, then you just wonder if people won't resist that and have their own arguments, And
then, of course, they demand
lose
sequels.
The story. Yes, and then they demand sequels, yeah.
My guest is Ann Beattie, who is an award-winning novelist and short story writer, and we are talking on today's Leonard Lopate at Large about the writings of Jean Stafford, another short story writer and novelist, although you've also written screenplays and even appeared in films. I don't think Jean Stafford did that. This is WBAI New York, 99.5 FM. Many people ask, and I'm sure you're bored from hearing this question, when you have an idea for a story, how do you know whether it's going to be a short story or a novel?
Mm-hmm. I wonder how many writers might be different than I am. Always, I wonder that, because people don't tend to talk about what the genesis of something was, or how they felt in the moment that they entered into something. Or sometimes, of course, you just start wading in and you don't know at all whether it might be a story, a vignette, a novel, a memoir, whatever it might be. I have to say that I just assume that my default mode is writing short stories because I don't like to think at all that they're like one another. I'm not wishing to be making cookie-cutter short stories. That would be the sign of complete failure. But never does it occur to me that I'm in for the experience of a novel unless I've already geared up for that, almost physically geared up for that.
So when you start a novel, you know that you're going to be writing a novel because you know that this is a long-term commitment.
I think maybe all but once or twice in my life. A couple of times things got out of hand.
Well, Jean Stafford wrote novels as well. She doesn't seem
Yes.
to have been as successful. Do you think that she was just a natural short story writer?
I think she was a natural short story writer. I mean, there are such. It's true, it's unusual that at least early on, especially because writers were and are encouraged to do this, where's your novel is what the publishers say so often. And I think MFA programs now have changed things and in a way changed things for the better in that you can have a collection of related stories, or you can be Elizabeth Strout and write Olive Kitteridge, and you can either look at them as stories or you can look at them linked as part of a larger narrative. So you could always make the argument it's really a novel masquerading as short stories, or vice versa, short stories masquerading as a novel, and so forth. But I only read the first of her novels, which was Boston Adventure, and it's in 2 parts. And I have to say that I don't notice those highs and lows of the absolute writing style within her short stories, even if she makes some move I don't personally love. But I think that you see it more when it has to happen at greater length. And, of course, obviously it does in a novel. It got great reviews. It was on the bestseller list. Other people were very enthusiastic about Boston Adventure.
I wonder if it's still in print.
I don't know about Boston Adventure, but I'm sure that the third novel, The Catherine Wheel, is in print, and The Mountain Lion may be in print. That's her second novel. I don't know.
Well, in the case of the short stories, which is what we are discussing, Farrar, Straus and Giroux has reissued this book, but this
Right.
won the Pulitzer Prize in 1970.
Yes.
People obviously thought that she was doing something special. She did have a special approach to language. And you say you like her use of the big words sometimes.
Well, I was really sort of flummoxed when I started reading because I was reading the book as a whole, and that's not often the way I read short stories when I'm not very familiar with a writer. I don't tend to just plow through a book, but I got interested. I mean, I could have taken more time off than I did from reading Jean Stafford, but it was only when I read her biographies that I came up with, not even to me, a completely articulated thought about this, but in that she felt like the odd person out in her family. What she did was to be very drawn to Latin phrases, learning foreign languages, dropping in a few words of French. N'est-ce pas, a character will say, I mean,
very Russian.
Very Russian. Pretty gratuitously, though, doing that kind of thing. And I think that also happens in some ways on a larger scale with her. That is that she has this tendency to want to go outside the text and have maybe not Jean Stafford per se, but some sort of projection of herself breaking the mystique of the language of the story with these kind of tossed off asides that suggest a learned person. But as we all know, if we say n'est-ce pas to somebody and we've used it wrong, we're doubly embarrassed than as we said, right,
Even if I use it right, I'd be a little embarrassed.
Me too. And now that's another quality that would make them look in some ways dated. It looks a little pretentious.
She had a rather dramatic life.
Very dramatic life.
And do we see that reflected in the stories?
Oh, I think so. I think particularly with the, the fact of her early illness that turned into so many different kinds of real physical illnesses as well as emotional illnesses as she got older, and her alcoholism can't be denied.
Married an alcoholic, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the story, The Echo and the Nemesis. What does the title refer to?
She said that she liked to steal titles, didn't she?
Yes.
She stole that title, right?
She stole a number of titles.
Yeah.
Or did paraphrases of titles.
Yeah.
It's clear in the story that who the Nemesis is and who's the Echo. But this is another one of those stories where the readers sense of what's going on changes over the course of reading the story.
Sure, there's that kind of power imbalance, there's that kind of call and response, there's that kind of disorientation that the reader feels that really is kind of the outgrowth of an internal confusion within the character and characters. Yeah.
Were the issues of class, beauty, food, and addiction as they relate to women being discussed much when she wrote this?
I don't know the answer to that.
Do you think she was ahead of her time in terms of writing about things like eating disorders?
She was outspoken and unusual for doing that. Whether there are some other people I could and should be able to come up with off the top of my head, I don't know. But, a lot of the stories did appear in the New Yorker, and the New Yorker then and now, really, this is, I only mean to commend them for this, but, they really do sort of want direct addresses of things that are current social concerns.
Well, many of your stories have appeared in the New Yorker as well, but there's a big difference. When Stafford was writing her stories, there were lots of publications that were...
In number, you mean, yeah.
Yeah, publishing short stories. And now, if you are a serious writer, you're pretty much either stuck with the New Yorker, or not stuck, it's a pretty terrific magazine, or some less well-read, the Sewanee Review, things like that.
Exactly.
So she published mostly in the New Yorker? I can't imagine Saturday Evening Post.
Well, I don't know about Saturday Evening Post, but for example, in those days, McCall's ran various very serious pieces, both fiction and nonfiction.
And
Esquire. But one of her last pieces for McCall's was going to interview Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. She did 3 interviews with her that appeared. That would not be the way in present day McCall's, we would be typifying the contents of the magazine. So I'm just agreeing with you. There were so many outlets. There were so many opportunities. And to go back briefly to the New Yorker, too, there is a magazine that really published women and had a very, very prominent female fiction editor, Catherine Angel, who became E.B. White's wife, Catherine Angel White, who was the editor of Jean Stafford. And, any number of wonderful women who were brought on board, edited by women and so forth. So maybe that just automatically made it a more conducive environment in some ways toward thinking you could have an audience if these were your written concerns.
Should we assume that she played a role in how some of these stories developed? How important is the editor at a magazine like The New Yorker?
Oh, terrifically so. And they really do edit, too. It's not as though they make a couple of queries in the margin. You are seriously edited, and then fact-checking does its own wonderful job. Because, of course, as a writer, if it's something you never questioned to begin with, you simply put in what you so-called know to be true. And they'll write back and say, no, that isn't who sang this. It wasn't Nico, it was Lou Reed. And I put it on, and I listened to it again Sunday morning. I thought, that isn't Nico? That's Lou Reed? Of course they're right, but why would I ever check that? Because I misperceived it to begin with. I mean, that's a very, very minor point.
But you read what you wanted to read into that.
Yes.
That recording.
Yes, of course. There you go. But, that's interesting, too, because whether they mean to or not, writers do a lot of things that, in effect, are more transparent than they think and even that betray them more than they realize. One wonders if Stafford were alive today, whether she would flinch about some of the things that she wrote, not because they were a naughty no-no to put there or something like that, but might she not go at it entirely differently now because these things were so rooted in the society of their time, which is not the society of our time.
In The Echo and the Nemesis, there is a hint of childhood sexual abuse, and
pretty strong hint,
and a connection is kind of made to food, sex, and repression. These are things that don't seem to be as surprising today, but it does seem to me like she was onto something.
Yes, I agree with you, and I never thought
maybe that's why we're not reading her as much now. We kind of know things that
we already know
she may have played a role in our understanding.
Oh, that's a very good point. I really hadn't thought about it that way. I do remember from the biographies, though, that she became very self-conscious and she said herself that she was very unhappy in her childhood. She said it in no uncertain terms. But partly she was, for whatever reason, teased by her sisters about her weight from the moment she was born. And it really hurt her. And she continued to be not a vain person, but almost a person who went to extremes to, wear odder things than she might have worn, or inappropriate things or something like that, almost as though she wanted to be criticized for that decision, not for the inner person, because of going back to her childhood. So, what you said about the food issues and all that kind of stuff, this is something for, she just couldn't assimilate and come out the other side of it with any ease.
And then she had another problem, which is that she had to have major facial surgery at some point in her life.
Yeah. I didn't know the details of that either until I really started reading the facts of the case. This is one of the most
shocking things we know about Robert Lowell as a great poet.
Yeah.
But he was her first husband.
Yeah.
And before they were even married, he was driving drunk, and they had a car accident. He was unscathed, and she suffered serious disfigurement.
For the rest of her life, too. She had to have repeated surgeries that were caused by that. And not only did he do that, but to flip forward in time at least once, there's documentation that he just plain slugged her. So, we're dealing with somebody who is the incarnation of problems. Yes, Lowell apparently was a notoriously bad driver. He was a very young man. He took, without permission, his father's car to go courting Jean Stafford. He was wildly drunk, and he turned down some lane or alleyway in Boston, and they crashed into a wall. And as you say, he was unscathed, and in fact returned to school in a timely fashion, and she was in for acutely painful surgeries, some of which she has detailed in various stories of hers.
And we'll get to that in just a moment. This is Leonard Lopate at Large. We're talking about the collected stories of Jean Stafford, which was issued not so long ago in a paperback version with a wonderful introduction by Joyce Carol Oates, by Farrar Straus and Giroux Classics. I guess they realized they had this treasure. It had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1970, and then it was just sitting there. You have brought in an earlier edition, well thumbed through.
Falling apart in my lap, yes.
And that was the original paperback version?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
You mentioned the story, A Country Love Story. No, I guess that title was meant to be ironic.
Yes, definitely meant to be ironic.
The husband is based on Lowell?
Absolutely.
What is his profession in the story?
That's a very good question. Is he a professor? I don't even remember. I think he's a professor. And after having had a breakdown, he is ordered to the country by his doctor. The doctor, as with all of the doctors in Stafford, is meant to be a quite villainous person, a very insensitive person, that's for sure. And that's the first story. I probably read a couple of Jean Stafford stories without registering the name Jean Stafford when I was younger, I'm embarrassed to say. But that was the first one that I ever read, and I thought, oh, yes, this is a short story by the wife of Robert Lowell. But I didn't know the background very deeply, and I certainly didn't know what was coming in that story. It's heartbreaking.
It's her description of what it's like to be involved with a mentally unstable man.
Yeah, and it really does come through, too.
Is this a strangely anti-feminist story? Doesn't it embrace the idea that a wife's duty is to endure for the sake of her marriage?
I don't think it's an anti-feminist story. I think it just shows the absolute inescapability of, a marriage wrought with these particular tensions. I mean, it would seem to me to be universal in those concerns, too.
You've brought along a poem by Lowell that...
I did actually. Could I read just a very brief passage from A Country Love Story, and then I'll read the poem? It's just so wonderful. For months she had lived with her daily dishonor, rattled, ashamed, stubbornly clinging to her secret. But she grew more and more afraid when oftener and oftener Daniel said, "Why do you lie to me? Why does this mood of yours What does it mean? And she could no longer sleep. In the raw night, she lay straight beside him as he slept, and she stared at the ceiling as bright as the snow it reflected, and tried not to think of the sleigh out there under the elm tree, but could think only of it and the man, her lover, who was connected with it somehow. She said to herself, as she listened to his breathing, if I confessed to Daniel, he would understand that I was lonely, and he would comfort me, saying, I'm here, May. I shall never let you be lonely again. At these times she was so separated from the world, so far removed from his touch and his voice, so solitary, that she would have sued a stranger for companionship. Daniel slept deeply, having no guilt to make him toss. He slept indeed as so well that he never even heard the ditcher on snowy nights rising with a groan over the hill, flinging the snow from the road and warning of its approach by lights that first flashed red, then blue. As it passed their house, the hurled snow swashed like flames. All night she heard the squirrels adding up their nuts in the walls, and heard the spirit of the house creaking and softly clicking upon the stairs and in the attic.
So he sleeps well and she doesn't.
Got it. Bring on the ambient, right.
Did that describe her personal dilemma, that her marriages were unsatisfying?
You know, I don't know whether, well, obviously, I don't know whether in real life she did create this romantic fiction in her life, but the passage I was reading is about an imaginary lover. The lover is only that, but the husband, Robert Lowell, here called Daniel, is so adamant in terms of feeling for paranoid reasons that he's been betrayed, that he's in a first draft of the story, which I just found out recently too, there actually is a scene where the husband throttles her. And that would have ruined this story because it's all so much under the surface, so covert, so painful, because of what's withheld. But this kind of outburst, it almost seems like, isn't that tranquil what I read you? The lovely snow and the snowplow and
but there's also, it sounds like a sexless marriage.
From that passage?
Yes.
Well, they're certainly living in their own realities, and there are those who do speculate. I mean, you read this about Lowell's life in Stafford's also, that who knows if it was a sexless marriage or not, but he once complained to a friend in a letter that Jean undresses at night in the closet. Doesn't seem to me to be particularly...
Despite his terrible behavior with her, he went on to marry a number of other really famous women.
Yes.
Elizabeth Hardwick.
Yes, Elizabeth Hardwick was his second wife, and in fact, he was en route back to reconcile with her when he died in a taxi cab in New York City. She was having him back. But, Stafford and Lowell never seem to have gotten over each other. I mean, maybe that's sometimes true of first marriages, especially when people are as young as they were, that they look back and they think it's perhaps only because of age that they made certain mistakes or had certain forms of naivete that didn't overlap well enough or something like that. But toward the end, when she needed money, Lowell always wrote her a check. I know that can sound very cavalier, but in other words, they were in touch. They'd never had a prolonged argument. They were, to some extent, available to each other always.
Although you wouldn't suspect that from reading some of these stories. Another one, The Interior Castle.
Oh.
What do you think of that as a title?
Well, it certainly is a monolithic story, and anytime we hear about castles, don't we immediately just sort of think, oh, this might be in some way a romance? So again, it's her anti-romanticism that's coming right in the minute we're cued as good readers to what that story is going to be about. But you also think about Franz Kafka, right, and the castle, and the what's there? There's no there, as the expression is,
Well, is it significant that in the story the driver of the car dies, and in real life, of course, Lowell escaped pretty much unscathed?
Sure.
It's the story, really, of an operation performed on a face and brain of a patient, some of it without anesthesia, and she actually had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
It just sounds terrible. I guess today it would have been different, but how much damage had been done to her face?
All I know is that internally, whatever had happened to her, it wasn't just a case of nasal reconstruction. I mean, and you just think about the proximity of the nose to the brain and so forth. I don't know in clear medical terms what it was that happened, but apparently, even for this very adept surgeon, this was like the worst of the worst cases, and he knew that. And I suspect it was one of those cases where people have to be kept somewhat alert during the procedure. Don't question her excruciating pain whatsoever, but it's very, very hard to write about pain.
But she
very hard.
Writes it in a rather restrained way, but with a lot of exactness.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's a perfect description of how she does it. That's exactly right. She pairs those things beautifully. Also, she was so used to finding a way, even in her more ordinary life, of being withholding, that her personal flamboyance might have been one thing, but her adaptability and her having to adjust to difficult circumstances in her life was always notable.
I was wondering whether, as she was experiencing these operations, she wasn't already forming a story in her head. Well, someday I'm going to write about this, and maybe even composing complete sentences.
Well, you do wonder. I mean, sometimes, the writer runs away from something that's a perfectly composed story, even because they feel that they know it in their own mind. And listen, it can be painful to write. I mean, painful in obviously a different sense than that kind of physical pain, but a lot of people would sort this out in their own mind and not see it as being literature. And I think it's because of a lot of the literary things that she does within this story that she was able to get it enough outside of herself that this would speak more humanely to a larger audience, really. It is about, having to bite the bullet. I mean, that's what it's about. You could then generalize and say, well, that's a lot of what Hemingway was about, having to bite the bullet. It wasn't an ingrained philosophical code for her the way it was with Hemingway, but that was the life she knew, as far as I know.
I mentioned earlier that you offered to read a poem by Lowell about this experience.
Yes, well, this is really interesting. So, Lowell, back to the other story, though, briefly, A Country Love Story, which is very related. I mean, exactly where I would go from there would be to The Interior Castle. But here is Robert Lowell's poem about that same situation. And let me just digress also and say that, Robert Lowell also was severely criticized by Elizabeth Hardwick, his wife, for including private letters into poetry that he wrote that was printed in a book. She wrote him and said, please, please, this is our private life. This is not what one does. And he quoted it verbatim.
Oh.
It exists. So anyway, we've now heard Gene Stafford.
He was a piece of work.
He was a piece of work. Yes, let's get that right out there. He was a piece of work. So this is Robert Lowell, called The Old Flame. My old flame, my wife. Remember our lists of birds? One morning last summer I drove by our house in Maine. It was still on top of its hill. Now a red ear of Indian maize was splashed on the door. Old Glory with 13 stripes hung on a pole. The clapboard was old red schoolhouse red. Inside, a new landlord, a new wife, a new broom. Atlantic seaboard antique shop, pewter and plunder shone in each room. A new frontier, no running next door now to phone the sheriff for his taxi to Bath and the state liquor store. No one saw your ghostly imaginary lover stare through the window and tighten the scarf at his throat. Health to the new people, health to their flag, to their old restored house on the hill. Everything had been swept bare, furnished, garnished, and aired. Everything's changed for the best. How quivering and fierce we were, there, snowbound together, simmering like wasps in our tent of books. Poor ghost, old love, speak with your old voice of flaming insight that kept us awake all night. In one bed and apart, we heard the plow groaning uphill, a red light, then a blue, as it tossed off the snow to the side of the road.
Back to that plow.
Killer.
They're both writing about the same sounds at night.
Yeah. I just couldn't believe that when I came upon that. But now with the Lowell poem, and I'm not saying that there's a hidden political agenda in this particular story of Stafford's, but Lowell both comes in for the personal. And, it seems very conversational, which Stafford doesn't often seem. They don't seem chatty or, informal
But she doesn't write a lot of dialogue either.
No, she stays away from it. I think
long
humility
paragraphs with
it's,
very little dialogue.
That's right, yeah. Always like the narrated or paraphrased thoughts of the inner mind of the person, which, as we all know, are different than the words we speak. Socially, they just tend to be very different. But you know, when he says the flaming insight that kept us awake all night, again, that idea of the flare, the burning, paradoxically within this snowy landscape and so forth, and then burning, taking it to its logical end, the connection with passion, and both her story and his poem having very much to do with that kind of physical passion, but also, you know, what was it really? I mean, what's predominant here isn't some Cupid that's hovering over the scene. It's this groaning snowplow instead. But with Lowell, the political comes in because it took me many readings of this poem to realize the obvious, which is that, okay, it's plowing the snow's white, and then we've got the red and we've got the blue. There it is, red, white, and blue. So it's a political critique as well.
Do we know whether he wrote this before she wrote her story? Is there some kind of a conversation going on here?
I wouldn't want to say the wrong thing. I would just be guessing. I don't know.
This is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. I'm speaking with Ann Beattie about the great short story writer Jean Stafford, who has been largely forgotten in recent times. You've described her writing as cinematic. In what way?
I think she relied very highly on visuals, and also she structured her stories so that if you understood the language, or if she could make the language sort of indelible enough, you would carry those visual images with you through the story. She wouldn't even have to come back to them, or certainly not come back to them in the same form.
And she uses objects in her story.
She does.
As stand-ins in some ways. Do you think that writing short stories is a visual process? Does it have a lot in common and demand the same kinds of skills as painting or writing for film?
Well, I'm married to a painter, you know, so I've learned a lot about painting, and I now look more seriously at painting. I have always personally been a visual writer, but that's not to say that if my husband and I walk into the Metropolitan, he doesn't instantly see things that I don't see, that I have to be led to and shown. You know what I mean? But when I say that I'm personally a visual writer, I'm very drawn to Stafford because of that, even though she often uses visuals differently than I use them. I think that it's a kind of showing of her ability to turn herself inside out and speak about the ways in which she's very sensitized to her environment, and therefore we must be too.
One of your novels, Chilly Scenes of Winter, was adapted into a film, and although it had a different title initially, and then they finally gave it the title that you'd given it?
Yeah, they wouldn't do it. They tried to send it out under an upbeat title, so they did marketing surveys, and they gave a true-false question to the audience. Chilly Scenes of Winter, this sounds upbeat, downbeat. And everybody says
that's leading.
Downbeat.
But wait, that's leading the response.
Oh, well, I mean, I think there may have been a grain of sophistication more to it, but everyone signed a petition on the movie, from Joan Micklin Silver, who had done the screenplay, who had been the director, to Amy Robinson, Griffin Dunn, Mark Metcalf, who had been the producers on the movie. Me, they didn't even want to hear from. They didn't care what I thought, but I got to sit on the sidelines. Everybody said, no, please. She's got a little cult following. It's a good title. Send it out as Chilly Scenes of Winter. They did the opposite. It didn't take off. They re-released it, and they recut the ending also. And that was because they didn't have any money to do extra shooting when they went back, so all they could do was freeze frame something, and they did. But that ending was slightly changed from head over heels, and then it now exists as Chilly Scenes of Winter.
And freeze frame, in a way, is saying we're not resolving.
Exactly. But also saying, and we're going to give you a moment to look at the ambiguities implied in this visual image, you know.
You've written screenplays?
I try. I mean, I never.
When you were writing that book, did you even think of it as something that could be a film, or does that not occur to you?
Doesn't occur to me.
You have appeared in films.
Well, only because I've managed to plead for the part. My right hand appeared in. Only my right hand appeared flipping burgers on a grill in a movie called Baby It's You.
Well,
I mean, I'm telling you, really, I'm not
did
just
you
making
get a
this
screen
up. It's
credit?
Well, not only that, but unbeknownst to me, I think I had like free medical insurance for a month or something for having done that. I was the waitress in Chilly Scenes of Winter too. I begged for that part.
Yes, I remember.
And in fact, I was so badly. It came out in 77, I believe, the movie 78, maybe, I can't remember. The book came out in 76. I do remember that. But when I went out to have my big moment in Hollywood, I was so badly dressed that they thought that they couldn't improve upon it. And the only thing they gave me was an uglier T-shirt with a deeper cleavage. They let me wear my jeans, my fry boots, my long hair. That was fine. And so, I was just highly amused.
You were typecast.
I was typecasting myself, and they were all for it.
So did you have to join the Screen Actors Guild? Because I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA.
Uh-huh.
And every time a film director comes in for an interview, I point out that if they ever need to cast somebody as a talk show host...
Oh, but you would have a real problem. I think the technicality is you can't have a speaking part, right? Because in Chilly Scenes of Winter, all I could do was gasp when somebody deliberately did something unexpectedly. That wasn't really saying anything. And my right hand, that's not about to happen unless we get finger puppets and I get a lot more different skills.
You've described your writing process as, at times, rearranging furniture in a room. What do you hope to achieve by that? And actually, first of all, what do you mean by that? And what do you hope to achieve by that?
Well, the writer has to shake up herself or himself, really, in a lot of ways. And if you didn't have some equilibrium, it would be awfully hard to undertake these things that really exist only in your head, even if you've made an outline. I don't even personally work from outlines. Even a novel, I don't work from an outline. But when I say rearranging the furniture, I guess I'm just taking the things that are familiar touchstones to me and trying to make them not so familiar. And as we all know, merely moving our chair can make the light fall differently on us when we sit there to read, or we stop sitting in it because now the chair is in an inconvenient place. You want to make some things inconvenient so that you wouldn't put your usual responses to those things directly into your stories. It's not about you, it's fiction. You're creating something. It's not about what you do in your living room.
Does the external world in a story reflect the internal world?
Oh, well, that's the great strength of what fiction can do. You operate by projection, displacement, symbolism, every other thing you can possibly call on that will make the story both recognizable as ordinary life, but will make it deepen as something more mysterious.
I mentioned earlier that Jean Stafford isn't remembered as well as some of her contemporaries. We do hear about young writers being influenced by Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty, but you don't hear about too many people being influenced by Jean Stafford. Why do you think that is?
I think they're rather long. The stories are really quite long. I can't say that I can't think of exceptions, but that isn't particularly in vogue right now. These very small stories, sometimes the shorter the better, are very much in vogue right now.
And those long paragraphs.
Those very long paragraphs, really, I did sympathize with myself. I had to bring out my strongest reading glasses to keep my nose to the book, reading about those. I think just that they mimic the shape of, let's say, Maupassant or something like that. But people might think of as a psychological investigation that nevertheless has a kind of a wholesome display within the story in which many things are elaborated. So Stafford doesn't so much, in spite of using the visuals and relying on them, she doesn't not tell you what somebody's thinking. You may realize, oh, that's very different than what I would have expected. This person is even more upset than I would have thought. Or, this person obviously is different than the other character there. Whereas I wouldn't know that if she weren't, in effect, pretending to read the inner life of that character. But I don't think that kind of going into the mind of the character is what we rely upon any longer. It's more what's ambiguous in what we see that's right before our eyes. Or what's interesting. Not even, ambiguity isn't a goal in itself, but what's meaningful in what we're not seeing. I've
always wondered just how important zeitgeist is to the creators of art.
Well, very few of them call it that, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you do see certain trends at different times.
Yes.
And I guess Jean Stafford is no longer part of the contemporary zeitgeist, even though it is really interesting to read these stories. And when you're reading them, you realize that you are reading a really interesting writer who had some very interesting things to say.
And I would say in a very good sense that, the cumulative effect of what she's saying about women and what she's saying about women in that time continues to be very meaningful. A lot of us would remember this as being true of our parents or of our grandparents.
But not millennials.
I don't think so. No, I must say. I mean, then you would be reading for aesthetic pleasure, and it's certainly there to be had.
Now, what are you working on these days?
Oh, me?
Yes. I mean, I read a recent amusing piece in the New Yorker, but
for Shouts and Murmurs,
yes.
yeah. I was very lucky they took that. I thought that was a little far out myself, as a matter of fact, called Tasting Notes for a Teetotaling President, yes, in which I invent a bunch of non-existent wines and give them significant names to the Trump administration. Yes, I had a good time writing that. Jean Stafford, though, was such a wonderful satirist, but she mixed it up. In other words, some of the deliberately funny things that I was writing for a column that's meant to display humor, she's so outlandish, she would put them in the middle of a very serious story, and you'd stop and you'd think, what? I mean, even if they're not so unusual, maybe in point of fact, she writes a story about a young girl who meets an older man at the library. She has a fantasy life about who he must be. She ends up having to go to his house to deliver to his elderly mother a plant. This is a conventional short story up to this point. And then there's the mother, who's a horror show, in bed, and you find out that the son is taking care of her and is not this wonderful, erudite, person she's imagined him to be. But as the story goes on, what pops up at a parrot? I mean, that's the oldest trick in the book. You can't really have much parrot talk unless you're the brilliant Robert Olin Butler, who did exactly that in his collection of short stories about, Vietnamese refugees that won the Pulitzer Prize also. But here's suddenly, this is like low humor, that the parrot has memorized all these formulaic things, clearly telling you what idiotic things the other owners said and so forth. And then you think, well, this story is totally derailed. Now here we are in this low comedy. But that's it for Stafford. It's like the painfulness of people's private lives, the way that comes up against things that are purely ludicrous, like the parrot, and then it ends on another note entirely. It ends on a note that really anyone reading it would be horrified and lack all sympathy for the main character of the story, the girl.
Did she feel that family relationships suffocated women? And I'm struck by the fact that so many of the characters, the bad characters, are women.
Well, that's the way she saw it. That's the way she saw it. I have to
mothers
say.
and boarding house owners and whatever, they are often very manipulative. They're rather mean-spirited.
I don't think she thought all that well of humanity. I mean, I know that's a sweeping generalization, but I think she was very troubled by what she saw in terms of both, domestic relationships and also what she saw in a larger sense. She protested the class system in Boston in her first novel hugely. She almost could have been out there marching on the street hollering these things.
How old was she when she died?
Oh, gee, she died pretty prematurely. I know she was born in 1915. She died when she was 74. Mm-hmm. She was probably in her, late 70s, mid to late 70s.
And do you hope that our conversation will get people reading the collected stories of Jean Stafford again?
Absolutely. And also, I don't think that at all we have to read things only because they directly comment on our time. I mean, I'm not saying that people do go around with that misperception, but they shouldn't and couldn't be advertised as that.
Well, we read Chekhov, and
we do.
Pretty great short stories, and they're all about a Russia that doesn't exist anymore.
But we love Chekhov because of what's on the page, and we would have to love Stafford for what was still off the page when there's so much there. When it's so physical. There's a real physicality to her stories, I think.
The Collected Stories of Jean Stafford has been recently reissued with a wonderful introduction by Joyce Carol Oates, by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. And thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to Ann Beattie, to Fran Higgins, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who engineered today's show. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.